Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. So now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on The History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople. And reaching that highest level, that of the See of Rome, we have, of course, Peter the Great. Now we have the next in our series on the 12 minor prophets with Garry Stevens. In today's episode, we'll discuss some different translation traditions of the Bible, how and why certain phrases got translated from one language to the next. Now, translation is a really hugely important discipline, and it comes up in every conversation you'll ever have in the Bible. Septuagint, Masoretic text, going one way and to the other. How these different phrases that are really loaded with meaning in one language get translated to a different language and culture, especially at these early times. We'll take a look into these translation issues and context in this episode, and we very well may be revisiting them again in later episodes. It's not too late to get your Q&As in for the Q&A episode. We're always willing to answer your questions, so send those in. I know Garry and I had a lot of fun in the series, and I hope you are as well. So I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you like those teaser episodes we've been putting out. There'll be more of those. And with that, here's another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to another exciting collaboration between the History and the Bible podcast with Garry Stevens. Garry, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
And the History of the Papacy podcast. Today we have a one-off episode that came out of kind of nowhere. Actually, I think it was 2 days before we started recording today. It's hard to tell when you're 17 hours apart what days are, but it wasn't too many hours ago where we kind of got confused about some of the namings. I think we were referring to somebody else, and we came to the conclusion that one of us was referring to the Greek name of one particular person, and the person also has a kind of a different name in Hebrew. And this whole thing of how do these names change, and then how do these names change so dramatically between the Hebrew Bible, written many millennia ago, to nowadays. If you crack your Bible open, how do they look and how do their names look? And also, Garry, you made a couple of interesting observations, so maybe we'll start with those, and we can even, before we even do that, we can take a look at some of those names of people who have a different name, and their names are pronounced in different ways in different Bibles and in different eras.
Yeah. I think actually one of the most interesting is the name of Jesus. Jesus in Hebrew is Yeshua or Yehoshua, and it means God rescues or salvation. And Yeshua or Yehoshua is also the name Joshua. So that guy Joshua, Moses' sidekick, has exactly the same name as Jesus.
That division too of Yehoshua, that it's Jesus and Joshua had the same exact name. I believe in the Septuagint they have the same name. They're both referred to as, or the Hebrew version, they use the same name.
Yes, in Greek they are both, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I have checked it, but I think it's Iosus.
Yeah.
They are both called Iosus. So there's no distinction made there. It's just in English. I haven't checked how it goes in French or German or Latvian, but that's an interesting distinction. Now, in the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation made by St. Jerome, Jesus is turned into Jesu. Well, actually, in Latin, Is the J pronounced with a Y sound, Steve?
That's something we can get into in a bit, but it really gets to the point that a lot of these languages changed so much, and Latin changed quite a bit during this period, where the J is one of the most complicated letters in at least Romance languages, and it even affected English through all the French influence. That in Latin at that time, antiquity and classical Latin, it would have been pronounced very similarly to the Greek, where you're kind of Iesus, and then eventually that EA, the I was getting kind of a je sound to it. In other Romance languages, like in Italian, it would turn into more of a proper j sound. In Spanish, it would turn into a h sound. So,
okay.
Jesus. So that's what gets kind of complicated, is that Greek was staying fairly similar, but Latin was changing. We'll take the Jesus example and bring that through to look at all the different sound changes that gets us from Yeshua, or the other versions are hard to say, Yehoshua.
Yeah, Yehoshua, yeah.
Yehoshua, how we get from that to Jesus in 2020 English. So some of these other names, like they might be familiar to others, like Micah, who we talk about in our 12 apostles. He's referred to in Greek as something approaching probably Macias.
Macias or something. In the Latin Vulgate, again, it seems to be a Macias compared to the Hebrew Macabre.
Somebody like Isaiah, who we would call Isaiah. I'll leave the Hebrew pronunciation to you.
In Hebrew, he is Yeshayahu, which basically means Yahweh is salvation.
But then he has a different name in Greek and in the Vulgate.
Yeah, can you read
the Greek is something approaching like Esaias, and then the Latin is Esaias or Esias, and I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation. And Jonas would in Hebrew be Yonah.
Yeah, Yonah.
With that, with the emphasis being on that second symbol, but in Greek it would be Jonas, or would it have been Ionas?
I suppose so. It'd be Ionas.
Ionas, and something similar to that in Latin. So the interesting part of why these names change so much is in a name, say like it's actually Jesus's name is probably one of the classic of sound differences from Greek to Hebrew. You have in Yeshua, we'll go with the easy one. The Greeks, the ancient Greek, at least in the Hellenistic Greek of the time of when the Septuagint was written, they didn't have a consonant ya sound like in the word yell. That's another really interesting thing that was actually happening at about this time, is Y was taking on characteristics of a vowel and as a consonant.
Right, okay.
This episode, we're going to maybe bore people on biblical things and in linguistics things. But I think it's really interesting, because I think when most people crack their Bible for the first time, or they're first interested, and they learn that Jesus's name was Yeshua and not Jesus, they think they've been kind of robbed, or that when you have all these words in Hebrew get filtered through Greek, then into Latin, which Greek and Latin are kind of similar in many ways, but then they were diverging at that point, and they had the devil was in the details and the differences too. And then you had Latin that went through a big change inside of classical Latin, Then it went through a big change into its daughter languages of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French. I mean, those are the big ones. And then there's, hundreds of other dialects and sub-languages that you don't even really hear of. One of the big subdivisions that really affects how we understand things in English is that Northern French that was spoken by the Normans when they conquered England. They introduced a lot of changes in how things were pronounced. Then fast forward into the 1600s, when a lot of the 1600s, when things start getting written down, and the biggest book, who can make a guess out there in podcast land, what's the biggest book that affected the way people understand English? The King James Version, obviously. There was a huge change going on in how English was spelled and spoken at that point, the so-called Great Vowel Shift, where that's what makes when people generally say that English is so hard to spell, it's because the rules were really getting locked in the old way, the old way that the vowels were being pronounced. And a lot of those words, like if you understand how that those vowels shifted, the spelling makes a hell of a lot more sense. And the patterns that we teach kids on how to spell things is really just making them understand how the old way of the vowels were said.
The massive problems with our spelling is that the spelling became frozen, but then the vowels changed.
Yeah. But so that's really what happens with a lot of these words, like Yeshua changes because Greek of the Septuagint, which the gospel writers leaned on heavily, that version of Greek didn't have a consonant ya sound. They also didn't have a sh sound. I cannot think of the linguistic term for that, so I won't use it. You look like an idiot using the wrong one. But that sh sound, which we use with a diagraph, we use sh to approximate the sh. So right off the bat, the Greeks didn't have the ya, and they didn't have the sh to even put that into their own language. And it's really hard to take a word from another language and just use it. I think we're more comfortable doing that now, but you'll still see, people will come from, China or, any number of countries or languages that don't have sounds that we can approximate. You butcher their names.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people will fault people for that, but sometimes it's really hard to get the sounds and the intonation right if they're not your natural sound system.
Yes, if you don't have I presume the vowels, the ones which are most difficult to warp, if you do not have that vowel in your own language, if you don't have them, then your brain just turns them into something else automatically, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so the Greeks were at that point a lot less interested in doing that and trying to approximate it than maybe we are in 2020.
Yeah. The Y and the sh sounds seem to be very common in Hebrew names. Very common.
Yeah.
And if you're missing those two, and the Greeks seem to have interposed S's quite a lot. Iosus. It's nothing like Yeshua.
That's something that happens naturally too, where that could have been something that I can't speak to this exactly, but will often turn to sounds as a natural progression, and then sometimes turn to sh as a natural progression too. But so that could have, that's another thing when we talk about dialects, is that the Hebrews who the Greeks could have been talking to might have been, in some median place where the sh and the s were kind of getting mushed together. That's also a really common one of the sh sound can be something that some people just never get. as like a kind of a pathology, that they're just not able to ever make that noise. A lot of them, like ch and those have a name that's like speech pathologists will use for those particular sounds, and some people are just never able to make them, which is just, since that whole, that's a huge question mark of, we presume that the Septuagint, it was done by 72 scribes, but you really don't know. You presume that they were native and fluent Hebrew speakers and Greek speakers, but we don't know 100% where they stood on any one of those languages.
It'd be funny if they all turned out to have odd speech impediments, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that would throw a major wrench in how they would do that.
Yeah, but in an era where standardized spelling didn't really exist, it'd be funny if the entire Septuagint and even the Vulgate, one massive misunderstanding on a micro level.
That happens a lot in Anglo-Saxon documents. They learn a lot about how people spelled things, because if somebody's writing something and there's not a standardized spelling and there's not standardized education, people are generally writing things the way they hear them. Yeah, but so it's really, it's so interesting to see how these names filter through the centuries. And I think as just one, I know in a previous episode, I don't think it was our James episode, I think it was on an episode I did on James the Just on my feed, I talked about how the name Yaakov or Yaakov, I'm not sure how it was pronounced precisely in Hebrew. I'm assuming something with the being on the second syllable.
I think it's Yaakov.
How Yaakov got to not only James, but Jacob in English. And that name is also interesting because it's Diego is derived from that. I believe Jacques is derived from that name. So you can see how that changed. But just since we're on Jesus, it's really interesting how his name gets from Yeshua to Jesus. Like we said, it goes first from the Greek eusos or iesos, which the Greeks, so they didn't have the Y, they didn't have the SH, so they substitute those. And then they tack on that S to the end to make it more fit into the Greek naming convention of having S's at the end of masculine names. Matthias, Alexandros, there's almost countless names of them that have names. It's really the unusual name in Greek that doesn't have the S at the end of it.
Aristarchus. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, never occurred to me.
Now, when it goes into Latin, they pretty much keep with the Iesus. That vowel at the end changes a little bit. The Latin language isn't so much hooked on having S's at the end of masculine names, but so they did wind up keeping that. But then you said in the Vulgate that S was dropped.
Yeah, for some reason.
Which that could be that oftentimes S's do get dropped at the end of words, but it could also make it fit more in with Latin naming conventions as well. But so then it kind of bounces around. J comes into the situation and starts getting a J and then a J sound. Then we come back in with the great vowel shift where that E letter goes from being pronounced as A. In Anglo-Saxon times, fairly much, it would have been pronounced something like Iesu or Iesus, but that the E gets transformed from an A sound, A, into an E sound. And I mean, presto, we have Jesus all the way from Yeshua. So that not only has basically every letter somehow changed in how it's pronounced, also the where the emphasis in the name gets shifted. And it's pretty easy how you can see how the name Joshua, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the more traditional biblical names start coming later in English. Joshua instead of, it was never really super popular in Western Europe for people's names to use Jesus as a first name. You'll only really see it in Spain, where Jesus is a common given name, but it's almost unheard of in the rest of Western Europe, and even in generally Christianity in general. And some people think that that was a medieval change in Spanish custom, because the name Muhammad is so common in Islam. People were maybe using the name Jesus as kind of a competition, or I guess there's a lot of different reasons why it could have been that, with the influence of Mohammed as being a very common given name, that, hey, why not start using Jesus as either a way to separate themselves or to, raise their own stock in medieval Spain.
Yeah. Or maybe just a case of, well, those guys take their big deal guy and use his name all the time. So,
yeah.
Why don't we?
And that's maybe why Joshua became more common in English, is later people, I don't know exactly when it became more common, but people are a lot less likely to name their child Jesus, but they want to tie it to that connotation. So let's use Joshua. And that's really why the Old Testament Joshua gets, they delineate and don't call him Joshua, is to keep him separated from Jesus, even though they have the exact same name in Hebrew. Yeah, I think that's this whole episode. It was kind of it's interesting.
Yes, this whole thing started as an accident, didn't it?
Yeah. I asked about Jonas and why some people, or no, I think it was, we were something about Elijah, and I had said that I saw his name being referred to as what I would say, and what you would probably say, is Elias.
Elias.
And Elias is a common enough name. It's not super common, but it.
Yeah, you wouldn't look twice at someone called Elias. So.
Yeah. And so how do those two names come apart? And you had looked it up in the your various versions of the Bible, and then we looked, it started to click that, hey, that's the sound changes probably brought that through, or depending on how when it came in from Greek. And then presto, here we are. We saved you in 20 minutes of going and probably looking. I'm sure PhDs have been done on this, or at least scholarly articles. So we've saved you at least some reading with this.
Yeah.
Or maybe you didn't think of it at all, and you can end this episode of, that was interesting.
That's interesting.
All right. Well, I think we're in good shape for this one. Definitely check out Garry's podcast with the History in the Bible, where you can find it at historyinthebible.com.
You can do that.
And you can find more about my show at a2zhistorypage.com. And I'm sure you will catch us next time with another exciting collaboration.
See you then.